The wind screamed across the Arizona desert like a banshee. It was 1882, and out here the land didn't care if you lived or died. It was a place of red dust, skeletal Joshua trees, and a sun that would cook you in your own skin. Sarah McKenna stood in the doorway of her lonely cabin, a worn shawl pulled tight around her. She was 26, but the desert had already carved the lines of an old woman into her face. Her husband Tom was 2 years gone, buried under a cheap wooden cross on the hill out back. A mining accident, they called it. A cave-in. Sarah called it the land taking its payment. "Mama, I'm hungry." The small voice belonged to Emma, her 5-year-old daughter. Her dress was patched, her face smudged with dust, but her eyes were bright. Sarah forced a smile. She always forced a smile for Emma. "I know, sweet pea. Let Mama fetch some water. We'll make cornbread." The creek was barely a memory, a damp scar in the earth. Fetching water meant scooping up wet sand and waiting for it to trickle into the bucket. It was a slow, back-breaking job, but it was all they had. She grabbed the bucket, her eyes scanning the floor for scorpions. It was a reflex, a simple rule of survival in a place that had 1,000 ways to kill you. Their cabin was a speck in the vast, empty wilderness. A full day's ride from the nearest town, Willow Springs. A full day's ride from help. As she walked the path to the creek, her mind drifted to the whispers she'd heard in town. Apache raids. The cavalry stretched thin. Families packing up and running for their lives. She pushed the thoughts away. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had Tom's old rifle by the door, and she knew how to use it. But the stories said you never saw the Apache. They were ghosts in the dust, until it was too late. That night the world went mad. A sandstorm hit without warning, a roaring wall of grit that blotted out the moon and stars. It wasn't just wind. It was an animal, clawing at the cabin, trying to tear it apart. Sarah barred the door and shuttered the windows, her heart pounding with the storm's rhythm. And then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the sand. It was a groan, human, full of pain, coming from somewhere out there, in the howling blackness. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to stay inside, to protect her daughter. Going out into that storm was suicide. It could be a trick, a trap. The desert was full of them. The sound came again, weaker this time, a dying whisper swallowed by the gale. She looked at Emma sleeping peacefully, and a war raged inside her. What kind of person hears a man dying and does nothing? What kind of mother leaves her child to walk into a storm? Tom's words echoed in her memory. A person's humanity isn't measured by their tribe or their skin, but by what they do when no one's watching. Cursing herself, cursing the desert, cursing God, she grabbed the rifle and her cloak. The wind nearly ripped the door from its hinges. Sand scoured her face, blinding her. She fought her way toward the creek, guided by a ghost of a memory. And there he was, a dark shape collapsed by a cottonwood tree. She approached slowly, rifle raised. The man was face down in the dirt. Dark stains soaked the ground around him. Blood, so much blood. With trembling hands she rolled him over, and her blood ran cold. Deerskin leggings, a beaded band around his forehead, the sharp, high cheekbones. An Apache warrior, the enemy, the savage from the campfire stories, the ghost in the dust. Her mind screamed, run, leave him, let the desert have him. It would be justice for the families, for the fear that choked every settler in the territory. But then she looked at his face. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man. Young, maybe 30, his features twisted in agony. A bullet had torn through his side and another had shattered his shoulder. His breath was a shallow, ragged thing. In that moment, he wasn't an Apache. He was just a human being, dying alone in the dark. And Sarah McKenna made a choice that would tear her world apart. She slung the rifle over her back, grabbed the man under his arms and began to drag him. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Every inch was a battle against the storm, against her own screaming fear. The wind tore at them. The sand tried to bury them, but she held on. She held on with a grim, stubborn strength she didn't know she possessed. By the time she hauled him inside, she was on the verge of collapse. She dragged him to the far corner, away from Emma's bed, and slumped against the wall, gasping for air. She had just invited death into her home, but looking at the unconscious man on her floor, she knew she couldn't have left him. She just couldn't. As the storm howled its fury outside, Sarah lit another lamp. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the enormity of what she was doing. She gathered her meager medical supplies, old sheets torn into bandages, a bottle of Tom's whiskey, and a sewing needle. This was madness. She knew it. She cut away his ruined shirt. The wounds were horrifying. The shoulder was a ragged hole, but the one in his side, that was the killer. The bullet was still in there, and the flesh around it was already turning an ugly, angry color. Infection was setting in. As she cleaned the wounds with whiskey-soaked rags, she studied his face. It was a strong face, etched with scars that told stories of a life harder than she could imagine. A small, beaded leather pouch hung around his neck. She didn't touch it. It felt sacred somehow. "Mama?" The voice was a whisper, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma stood in the doorway to the sleeping area, rubbing her eyes. "Back to bed, sweet pea," Sarah said, trying to sound calm. She moved her body, trying to shield the wounded man from her daughter's view. But it was too late. "Who's that?" Emma's voice was filled with a child's pure curiosity. No fear, not yet. "He's a traveler. He got hurt in the storm," Sarah lied. "Like that rabbit we helped. Remember? Now back to sleep." Emma, bless her innocent heart, toddled back to bed. Sarah pulled the curtains shut, her mind racing. The rabbit lie wouldn't hold up in the light of day, but she'd deal with that later. Right now, she had to get that bullet out. She remembered watching Tom dig buckshot out of his own leg once. He'd been so calm, his hands so steady. She tried to channel that, to be him for a moment. She sterilized the needle in the lamp's flame until it glowed red hot. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and began to probe the wound. The man groaned, his body tensing, but he didn't wake. Sarah bit her lip, tasting her own blood. She pushed deeper, feeling for the foreign object. There, a faint scrape of metal on metal. Using the needle like a tiny curved hook, she carefully, painstakingly worked the lead slug free. It came out with a sickening pop and a fresh gush of blood. She slapped a clean cloth over it, pressing down with all her weight, praying for the bleeding to stop. By the time she was done, dawn was breaking. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and silent. Sarah was exhausted. Her dress was stiff with another man's blood, and an Apache warrior was breathing shallowly on her cabin floor. She burned the bloody rags in the stove, scrubbed the floorboards until her knuckles were raw. She had to erase any sign, any evidence of her crime. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of her neighbors, she was a traitor, harboring the enemy, an act that could get her hanged. But as she looked at the man, now covered with Tom's old buffalo hide, she felt no regret, only a deep, cold dread. What in God's name had she done? For 3 days, the man was a ghost. He drifted in a fever dream, muttering in a language that sounded like stones rattling in a dry riverbed. Sarah kept him hidden in the tiny storage room, moving him there while he was unconscious. She told Emma he was a friend who needed to rest where it was quiet. Emma, thankfully, seemed to accept this. The fever was the worst part. He burned with it. His skin was fire to the touch. She spent hours bathing his face with cool water, forcing sips between his cracked, parched lips. He would thrash wildly, his eyes wide but unseeing. Once he grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would crush it. She didn't pull away. Instead, she started to hum, the same simple lullabies she sang to Emma. And slowly, miraculously, the tension left his body. His hand loosened. He fell back into a restless sleep. On the 4th morning, she opened the storage room door and found him awake. His eyes were open, and they were watching her. They weren't the delirious eyes of a fevered man. They were sharp, intelligent, and wary as a cornered wolf. She held up the bowl of thin broth she'd brought, a peace offering. She set it on the floor and took a step back, giving him space. "Water?" he rasped. The word was rough, but it was English. She brought him a cup. He tried to sit up, a grunt of pure agony escaping his lips. Pride radiated from him. He would rather die than ask for help. But his body betrayed him. He slumped back, his face pale. Sarah didn't think. She just acted. She moved forward and slid an arm behind his shoulders, helping him sit. He flinched at her touch but was too weak to resist. "You're safe," she said softly. "Drink." He drank, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He was trying to read her, to understand the impossible situation he found himself in. When the cup was empty, he pushed it away. Why? The question hung in the small, dark room, heavy with a century of blood and hatred between their peoples. Sarah met his gaze. "Because my husband taught me that leaving a man to die is a sin, no matter what color his skin is." He was silent for a long time, his breathing the only sound. "Your people will kill you for this." "Maybe," she said, her voice betraying a tremor she couldn't hide. "But that's tomorrow's worry. Today, you need to eat." He didn't argue this time. He took the broth and ate it slowly, deliberately. A fragile truce had been declared. Over the next few days, a strange rhythm settled over the cabin. She learned his name was Nietzsche. He told her it meant friend in his language, though he said it with a wry, bitter twist of his lips. He was a warrior, as she'd guessed. He'd been separated from his band during a fight with the cavalry. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, offering no more information than necessary. Emma was the one who broke through his reserve. Children have no concept of enemies. To her, Nietzsche was just a new, fascinating person. She'd peek into his room, then growing bolder, she'd sit near the doorway and chatter at him, showing him her favorite smooth stones and her doll made from a corn husk. One afternoon, Sarah entered to find Emma showing Nietzsche her doll, explaining its pretend family history in great detail. Nietzsche was listening with a solemn gravity, as if he were hearing the words of a great chief. "She has no fear," he said to Sarah after Emma had skipped off to chase a lizard. "Sometimes," Sarah replied, changing his bandages, "children see things more clearly than we do." The wounds were healing, slowly, but they were healing. "You are not afraid," he stated. It wasn't a question. Sarah paused, her hands hovering over the clean bandage. "I'm terrified every single second of the day," she admitted quietly. "But being scared and doing what's right are two different things." As she reached for the bandage, he caught her hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his skin warm. It sent a jolt through her, a feeling so foreign she almost flinched. "Your husband," he said, his eyes glancing around the cabin at the small signs of a man's presence. "He is gone." 2 years, she whispered, pulling her hand away, unsettled by the contact. "A mining accident." "This is why you understand," he said, his voice low. "Loss makes a person see. It burns away the lines others draw in the sand." That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she heard it. The one sound she had been dreading. The thud of approaching horses. Her blood turned to ice. Visitors out here were rare, and they never brought good news. "Get in the storage room," she hissed at Nietzsche. She grabbed Emma and pushed her in with him. "Don't make a sound, not a single sound. Do you understand?" She closed the door, grabbed Tom's rifle and stepped outside, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. 3 men sat on their horses, their faces hard and grim. She recognized them. John Patterson and the Miller brothers, neighbors from down the valley. "Evening, Mrs. McKenna," Patterson said, tipping his hat. But there was no warmth in it. "Sorry to bother you." "What is it, John?" she asked, keeping her voice as level as she could. "Apache war party hit the stage station over at Devil's Creek," he said, his eyes scanning her property, missing nothing. "Killed 2 men, made off with a whole mess of supplies. We're riding to warn folks." Sarah's mouth was as dry as the creek bed. "I haven't seen anything." "You sure?" one of the Miller brothers asked, his gaze lingering on the cabin door. "We're telling folks to head into town for a bit. It ain't safe for a woman alone." "I appreciate the thought," Sarah said, gripping the rifle tighter. "But this is my home. Tom built it to last." Patterson nodded slowly, his eyes unreadable. "Your call, ma'am, but I'd keep that rifle close. They're saying one of the Apache was wounded in the fight. Got away." He paused, and his next words struck Sarah like a physical blow. "We found a blood trail, heading this way." After they rode off, Sarah sagged against the doorframe, her legs threatening to give out. A blood trail, heading this way. It was no longer a question of if they would find him. It was a question of when. She went back inside and found Nietzsche standing, leaning against the wall, his face a grim mask. He had heard everything. "I bring danger to you," he said, his voice flat. "I must leave." "You can't," she said, her voice shaking. "You're too weak. That wound will kill you if you try to ride." "Better to die in the hills than to see you hang from a rope," he countered, a cold fire in his eyes. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the moonlit desert, a prisoner in her own home. Their time was running out. She knew it. The desert had given her a choice in the storm, and she had chosen compassion. Now the desert was coming to collect its price, and she was afraid it would cost her everything. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Sarah's veins. She was living on a knife's edge, and the ground was crumbling beneath her. The fear was a living thing in the cabin. It sat with them at their meager meals. It lay beside her on her corn husk mattress at night. Nietzsche grew stronger, but his healing was agonizingly slow. He was frustrated, caged. He would pace the small confines of the storage room like a trapped mountain lion, his anger and helplessness a palpable force. And then, a new crisis. The food was running out. Sarah looked into the root cellar, her heart sinking. A few withered potatoes, a half-empty sack of beans. Her last bit of flour had been ruined by mice. They were down to maybe 2 days of food. Emma's constant refrain of, "I'm hungry, Mama," was becoming a dull, constant ache in her chest. She had to go to Willow Springs. There was no other choice. But the thought of leaving Emma alone with Nietzsche, an Apache warrior, a man her people considered a savage, it was unthinkable. But taking them both with her, that was a death sentence. "I will watch the child," Nietzsche said when she voiced her dilemma. He saw the doubt and fear in her eyes. "She is safe with me. You know this." She did know it in a place deeper than thought. She had seen him with Emma. The patience in his eyes, the gentle way he'd carved a tiny coyote from a scrap of wood for her. But the world outside didn't see that. The world saw an enemy. "If anyone comes," she started. "I will hide," or he finished for her. "I will not be found. But you cannot let your daughter starve because of me." He was right. Her fear for what might happen couldn't overshadow the reality of what was happening. Emma was hungry. His next words sealed it. "I swear on the spirits of my ancestors, I would die before I let any harm come to her." The sincerity in his voice was absolute. Sarah made her decision. The ride into town was agony. Every mile felt like a betrayal. She pushed her old mare, her mind filled with horrific images of what could be happening back at the cabin. The town was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. The fear was thick in the air. Men walked with rifles in their hands, their eyes constantly scanning the hills. Sarah tried to be quick, trading her last few jars of preserved peaches for flour and salt. But she was stopped by the town gossip, Mrs. Henderson. "Sarah McKenna, good heavens, girl, what are you doing riding in alone?" The woman squawked. "The savages are on the warpath. They found the Garrett family's wagon just yesterday, burned to a crisp. No sign of them." Sarah tried to push past, her skin crawling. "I have to get back." Mrs. Henderson grabbed her arm, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The marshal's getting up a search party, a big one. They're going homestead to homestead, checking on folks, making sure no one's harboring any of them wounded Apache." Sarah's blood ran cold. Search party, homestead to homestead. "They'll probably be out your way in a day or two," Mrs. Henderson added, oblivious to the terror she just unleashed. The ride home was a frantic, desperate race against time. A day or two. She might only have hours. She burst into the cabin, her heart in her throat, expecting the worst. She found Emma and Nietzsche sitting on the floor, a piece of yarn stretched between their hands, deep in a game of cat's cradle. The simple domesticity of the scene was so jarring it almost made her weep. That night after Emma was asleep, she told him, "A search party is coming. They're going door to door." His face became a mask of stone. "Then I leave tonight." "You can't," she pleaded. You're still not strong enough. You're burning with fever again. She'd felt it when she'd brushed against him. The ride would kill him. He staggered to his feet to prove her wrong. His hand pressed against the wound in his side. I will not be the reason they put a rope around your neck. He took one step and his legs gave out. She caught him just before he hit the floor. He was terrifyingly light. The fever was consuming him. They were trapped. If he stayed, they would be found. If he left, he would die. And then, an idea sparked in the darkness of her mind. A desperate, terrifying idea. The mine, she whispered. The old mine shaft where Tom died. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with fever. What? It's boarded up, but the first chamber is stable. Tom shorted up himself. You could hide there. They'd never think to look in a place like that. It was a place of death, a place she hadn't gone near in 2 years, a place still haunted by her husband's ghost. If they find my trail leading there, he argued weakly, they will know you helped. Let me worry about that, she said, her mind made up. Getting him there was a nightmare. He leaned on her, his breath coming in ragged gas. The path was steep and treacherous in the dark. The entrance to the mine was like a black mouth, waiting to swallow them. It smelled of damp earth and old sorrows. She pried the boards loose and helped him inside. The air was cold, still. She spread blankets on the dusty floor, settled him down, and gave him the water and food she'd packed. I'll come back as soon as I can, she promised. Don't make a sound. He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Sarah McKenna, he rasped, I owe you a debt I can never repay. Just stay alive, Nietzsche, she said. Just stay alive. 2 days later they came. Marshal Coleman, a man with eyes as cold and pale as a winter sky, led 6 men into her yard. They were polite, but their politeness was a thin veneer over something hard and dangerous. Just a routine check, Mrs. McKenna, the marshal said, but his eyes were stripping her soul bare. They searched everything, the cabin, the root cellar, the chicken coop. Sarah stood by the door, holding a trembling Emma, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. Been quiet out here? Coleman asked, his gaze fixed on her. As always, Marshal, she lied. The word felt like acid on her tongue. He walked the edge of her property, his eyes on the ground. He was a tracker, she realized. He wasn't just looking. He was reading the story written in the dust. He knelt, picking up something small. A pebble? A leaf? Her heart stopped. He studied it for a long moment. Then, without a word, he tossed it aside and mounted his horse. There's been Apache sign all through this valley, he said, his voice flat. If you see anything, you send word. It wasn't a request. It was an order. As they rode away, Sarah felt a wave of relief so powerful her knees buckled. But it was followed by a chilling certainty. Coleman didn't believe her. He suspected something, and he would be back. That night, she slipped away to the mine. The cold, damp air had been poison for Nietzsche. The fever was raging, and the wound in his side had reopened. It was seeping through the bandages. He was worse, much worse. She had to get him out of there. With agonizing slowness, she helped him back to the relative warmth of the cabin. She knew it was a risk, a terrible risk. Coleman could return at any moment, but leaving him in that cold, damp tomb wasn't a risk. It was a death sentence. She cleaned and redressed the wound, forcing broth and willow bark tea down his throat. She sat with him through the night, listening to his delirious ramblings, feeling the heat radiate from his body. She had saved him from the storm, saved him from the bullet, saved him from the search party. But now she was losing him to the fever. A week passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Nietzsche's fever broke, but it left him as weak as a newborn kitten. Sarah felt like she was stretched to the breaking point. She was constantly watching the horizon, waiting for the dust cloud that would signal Coleman's return. One afternoon, she took Emma to a small meadow to dig for wild onions, just to get out of the suffocating tension of the cabin. It was only for an hour, but an hour was all it took for her world to fall apart again. When they returned, there was a horse tied outside the cabin. Not a cavalry horse, not a settler's horse. It was a painted pony, lean and wiry, with a single eagle feather tied in its mane. An Apache horse. Sarah's first thought was that they had come for revenge. She pushed Emma behind her, her hand reaching for the rifle she'd foolishly left inside. She crept to the door and peered through a crack. A woman was inside. She was young, fierce, and beautiful, with eyes like chips of obsidian. She was speaking to Nietzsche in their harsh, guttural language. When Sarah stepped into the doorway, the woman spun around, her hand flashing to the knife at her belt. "Ayanna, no!" Nietzsche said sharply in his own tongue. The woman froze, her glare fixed on Sarah. "This is my sister, Ayanna," Nietzsche explained, his voice strained. "She has been looking for me." Ayanna's eyes swept over Sarah, taking in her patched dress, her white skin, the fear she couldn't hide. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She spat a stream of angry words at Nietzsche, gesturing at his bandages at the cabin. "She says I shame our people," Nietzsche translated, his gaze lowered, "that I am weak to accept help from a white woman." "You would have died without my help," Sarah shot back, her own anger flaring. Ayanna seemed to understand. She let out a short, derisive laugh and said something else to her brother. "She says that would have been a more honorable death," Nietzsche said quietly. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time she saw shame in his eyes. The argument between them was fierce. Ayanna was insistent, her voice sharp and demanding. Nietzsche was weak, his responses strained. Finally, Ayanna seemed to make a decision. She turned her hard gaze on Sarah and spoke, for the first time, in halting English. "You saved my brother," she said, the words sounding like they were being dragged from her throat. "For this, I give warning." "Warning?" Sarah asked, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. "Men come," Ayanna said. "Many men, with long guns. They know an Apache hides here. They followed my trail." She turned back to Nietzsche. "We leave, now." "He can't travel," Sarah protested. "He's too weak." "He is Apache," Ayanna snarled. "He is not weak like you." She moved to her brother's side, pulling him to his feet. Nietzsche swayed, his face slick with sweat, but he straightened his shoulders, his pride warring with the pain. He knew she was right. To stay meant death for all of them. As they prepared to leave, Nietzsche stopped in front of Sarah. He reached up and removed the small beaded leather pouch from around his neck. He pressed it into her hand. "For protection," he whispered, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "So you remember. Not all are enemies." His fingers brushed against hers for a fleeting second. Then he turned and, leaning heavily on his sister, limped out of the cabin and disappeared into the twilight. The silence they left behind was deafening. The cabin, which had felt so dangerously full, now felt terrifyingly empty. Sarah held the small pouch in her hand, the leather still warm from his skin. Ayanna's warning echoed in her ears. Many men, with long guns. They knew. They were coming. She looked at Emma, who was watching her with wide, frightened eyes. And in that moment, Sarah knew. This place, this home that Tom had built with his own two hands, this land they had bled for. It was no longer safe. It had become a trap. That night she didn't sleep. She held Emma close, listening to the sounds of the desert, knowing that somewhere out there, armed men were riding toward her. Come dawn, they would run. But as the first pale light of morning touched the horizon, she heard it. The thunder of hoof beats, too many to count, coming too fast. They hadn't waited for dawn. They were already here. Sarah had barely managed to throw a few essentials into a saddlebag when they swarmed the yard. It wasn't just Marshal Coleman this time. There were at least a dozen riders, their faces set like stone. And at the front, beside Coleman, sat a man who made her blood freeze in her veins. Samuel Morrison, the territorial Indian agent. A man known for his cruelty, a man who believed the only good Apache was a dead one. His eyes were small and black, like a pig's, and they fixed on Sarah with a sickening intensity. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. McKenna?" Coleman asked, his voice laced with cold satisfaction. I was heading to town," Sarah stammered, "for safety." Morrison dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, like a spider approaching a fly. His gaze swept over her meager belongings tied to the horse. "A little late for that, I'd say. We got a report from one of your neighbors. Said he saw Apache tracks near your creek bed, tracks of a pony belonging to a warrior named Nietzsche, and his sister, Ayanna." He said the name, Ayana, and watched her face, looking for a reaction. Sarah's mind went blank with terror. She couldn't speak. Funny thing, Morrison continued, a cruel smile twisting his lips. That name keeps popping up. The name of a warrior we wounded at Devil's Creek. His blood trail led us right into this valley before it vanished. Right about here. He took a step closer. I don't suppose you know anything about that. No, she whispered. I know nothing. No. Morrison's smile widened. Then you won't mind if we have a more thorough look around. This time, it wasn't a search. It was a violation. They tore the cabin apart. They ripped open her mattress, scattering the corn husks. They smashed her jars of preserves, overturned the furniture. Emma was crying, clinging to Sarah's legs. Then one of the men came out of the storage room. In his hand, he held a small, carved wooden coyote, the one Nietzsche had made for Emma. Morrison took it from the man, turning it over in his fat fingers. Well now, what have we here? This is fine Apache carving. You've been a busy little girl, haven't you? He said, leering at Emma. Sarah's control snapped. Leave her alone. Oh, I will, Morrison said smoothly, as soon as you tell me where they are. I don't know. Wrong answer, he hissed. He nodded to two of his men. They grabbed Sarah, twisting her arms behind her back. Marshal Coleman just stood and watched, his face impassive. I'm going to ask you one more time, Morrison said, his face inches from hers, his breath sour. Where is the savage, Nietzsche? I don't know, she sobbed. Fine, Morrison said, stepping back. He drew his pistol. He didn't point it at Sarah. He pointed it at Emma. The world stopped. The sound of the wind, the stamping of the horses, the crying of her daughter. It all faded away into a deafening roar in Sarah's ears. You have 5 seconds, Morrison said, cocking the hammer. 5. Time stretched and warped. Sarah's mind was a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. 4. She looked from the gun to Emma's terrified face, then to Marshal Coleman. His expression hadn't changed. He was going to let this happen. 3. A desperate primal scream built in her chest, but no sound came out. Her throat was paralyzed with fear. 2. And then a sound cut through the silence. A high, piercing cry that was not human. It was the cry of a hawk, but it came from the ridge overlooking the cabin. Morrison paused, his head tilting. What the hell was that? Before anyone could answer, the cry came again. And this time, it was answered by another, from a different direction, and another. Suddenly, the ridges surrounding the small homestead were no longer empty. Dark figures on horseback appeared, materializing from the rocks and scrub brush as if from the earth itself. They were silent, motionless silhouettes against the morning sky. Apaches, not 1 or 2, a dozen, maybe more. Morrison's men scrambled for their rifles, their faces pale with shock. It's a trap, one of them yelled. Then 2 figures rode forward from the group on the main ridge. They came down the rocky slope slowly, deliberately. It was Nietzsche, sitting tall on his pony, his face a mask of cold fury. And beside him rode Ayana, a rifle held across her lap. Morrison! Nietzsche's voice boomed across the valley, strong and clear. You are looking for me! Morrison stared, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. Well, I'll be damned. The savage came back to die. He kept his pistol aimed at Emma. Drop your weapons or the child dies first. Let the woman and the child go, Nietzsche said, his voice dangerously calm. This is between you and me. I don't think so, Morrison sneered. I think I'll kill them all, starting with her. He tightened his grip on the pistol. Sarah closed her eyes, a final, despairing prayer on her lips. Morrison! The voice wasn't Nietzsche's. It was Marshal Coleman's. Everyone turned to look at the marshal. He had drawn his own pistol, but it wasn't pointed at the Apache. It was pointed directly at Samuel Morrison. Put the gun down, Sam, Coleman said, his voice as cold as a grave. Now! Morrison stared at him, bewildered. What are you doing, Coleman? Have you lost your mind? They're savages. I might be a lot of things, Coleman said, his pale eyes narrowed, but I don't make war on children. Put it down. For a heart-stopping moment, Morrison hesitated. Then something shifted in the standoff. Nietzsche spoke again, but this time he wasn't speaking to Morrison. He was speaking to Coleman. "This man," Nietzsche said, pointing at Morrison, "is a thief and a liar." "Shut your mouth, you red devil!" Morrison shrieked. "He does not hunt us for justice," Nietzsche continued, his voice ringing with authority. "He hunts us to cover his crimes. The supplies we took from Devil's Creek, they were not stagecoach supplies, they were government rations. Flour, sugar, blankets, meant for our people on the reservation, the people he is supposed to be helping." A murmur went through Coleman's men. "He sells them to the miners for gold," Nietzsche declared. "And when the army asks where the supplies have gone, he tells them the Apache stole them. He creates the war he is paid to prevent." "It's a lie," Morrison screamed, his face turning purple. "He's a lying savage." "Is it?" Coleman asked softly, his eyes never leaving Morrison. "Because I was just in Willow Springs, talked to a freighter. He told me a funny story about how he delivers government supply wagons not to the reservation, but to Morrison's private warehouse." Morrison's face went slack. The color drained from it. He was caught. "And that little thing I picked up here the other day," Coleman continued, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small object and tossed it onto the ground. It was a spent brass cartridge. Army issue, but the scrapes on it, they match the rifles Morrison issued to his personal deputies. Not cavalry rifles. You weren't fighting cavalry that day, were you, Nietzsche? You were fighting Morrison's hired guns. The truth hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Morrison was a criminal. He'd orchestrated the whole thing. The raid, the deaths, the hunt, all of it. In that moment of stunned silence, Morrison made his move. He shoved Emma aside and swung his pistol toward Coleman, but he never fired. An arrow, appearing as if from nowhere, sprouted from his throat. He staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face, his hands clutching at the feathered shaft. He made a gurgling sound and collapsed into the red dust. Silence. Everyone looked up at the ridge. Ayanna was lowering her bow, her expression unreadable. Coleman slowly holstered his pistol. He looked at Nietzsche. He looked at the warriors on the ridge. Then he looked at Sarah, still trembling, holding her daughter tight. He walked over and cut the ropes on her wrists. "Get your things, Mrs. McKenna," he said gruffly. "You and the girl. It's time you went to town. For good." He turned to his men. "We're leaving." One of the deputies stared at Morrison's body. "Marshal, what about him?" Coleman didn't even glance at the dead man. "The coyotes are hungry." He mounted his horse, and without another word, he and his men rode out of the valley, leaving Sarah alone with the Apache. Nietzsche rode down to her. He stopped his pony a few feet away. The silence between them was vast, filled with everything that had happened. "The pouch I gave you," he said finally. "It contains seeds from the spirit tree of my people. Plant them somewhere safe. They will grow strong, a reminder that even in the driest ground, life can find a way." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a true smile reach his eyes. "You have the heart of a warrior, Sarah McKenna." "So do you, Nietzsche," she whispered. "So do you." He nodded once, a gesture of deep, profound respect. Then he turned his pony and, with Ayanna and the rest of his people, rode back up into the hills and vanished, becoming ghosts in the dust once more. Sarah stood there for a long time, holding Emma's hand, the small leather pouch clutched in her other. The desert was quiet now. The wind had died down. The sun was warm on her face. She had lost her home, but she had found something else, something she didn't even know she was looking for. She had faced down the worst of her world and the worst of another, and in the space between, she had found not savagery, but honor, not hatred, but humanity. And in the unforgiving heart of the Arizona desert, she had survived. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of unbelievable choices and impossible survival, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You never know what story is waiting to be told just over the next ridge.